Starting, all attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. Welcome to Biometrics and Money, enabling the future of identity-first finance, the latest webinar from FindBiometrics and our premier financial event partner, Money 2020. My name is Peter Counter, and I am the editor-in-chief of FindBiometrics and Mobile ID World, the leading online resource of biometrics and digital identity thought leadership. With daily industry news, insightful featured articles, live event coverage, and now the ID Talk podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher, we cover the industry like no one else. I'm proud to say that we are the home of the next generation identity conversation, which includes the FindBiometrics Year in Review, the longest running survey of its kind, launching today after this webinar's conclusion. Everyone in attendance today will be the first to receive an invitation to be part of our celebration of the decade. Have your voices heard in what's set to be FindBiometrics' largest, most comprehensive year in review event yet. Today, I am your host and moderator for this webinar. The webcast will last 45 minutes to an hour, depending on audience participation. As questions occur to you while watching this broadcast, please type them into your go-to control panel right away. That will give our administrators enough time to sort through them in time for the audience Q&A portion near the end. We're expecting quite a large amount of participation, given that there are hundreds of registered attendees today. Before we start, I want to take a moment to acknowledge our sponsors for FindBiometrics' Financial Biometrics Month and this webinar. They are Onfido, BioConnect, and Idemia. We have a lot to fit into a short time today, so let's jump into the topic at hand. Money and biometrics. Just 2 weeks ago, FindBiometrics was in Las Vegas, reporting live from Money 2020 with audio interviews. And we also hosted a panel, moderated by our VP of Digital Content, Susan Stover. The panel discussed the role of biometrics and UIX design in ending the password for financial applications. Today, we're going to be revisiting a few of the topics discussed in Vegas and begin to expand on that conversation. Biometrics owe a lot of their current mainstream popularity to the financial sector. Aside from locking and unlocking our phones, the primary end user touchpoint with face, fingerprint, iris, and voice recognition is payments and banking technology enabled on the mobile channel. Over the last half of the decade, we've seen biometric fintech evolve from simple conveniences like Apple Pay to mobile banking login to cutting-edge commerce that we see today. Biometrics don't just make payments convenient, they help you open bank accounts remotely, they secure debit and credit card transactions at point of sale, they even enable what FindBiometrics calls naked payments, in which consumers transact at point of sale with nothing but their biometrics. Essentially, you could do a transaction with absolutely nothing but your body, hence naked payments. And that's to say nothing of the back end, protecting institutions and users from the harmful effects of data breaches and sophisticated fraud, as well as insider threats, while navigating an increasingly complicated regulatory landscape. Sanjeev Kalita, the Chief Marketing Officer of Money 2020, can't join us today due to a travel emergency, but he sent me his notes on the major trends from the conference. In the immediate term, the focus and activity has been on scaling up and upscaling. In terms of scaling up, we're seeing several large players merging in order to get more scale. Part of this is to gain cost advantages, but it will also offer some vertical integration opportunities in the financial services value chain. In terms of upscaling, we're seeing M&A activity around large companies buying other companies to offer unique services to their existing customers. For example, enabling a bank to create new identity experiences more quickly through an existing vendor than they had when onboarding a new vendor. In the short term, identity and privacy and security are front and center. So much of the future is predicated on getting this right, and there are many questions about how to make it work. The balance between convenience and security is one of the crucial questions in the industry. This has implications for other short-term trends such as AI, cloud services, and the expansion of mobile networks such as 5G. In the long term, Facebook's Calibra and Libra were a big topic of conversation at Money 2020. putting in the context of the central banks seriously looking at digital currencies, it's important. Also in the future, we'll have more connected devices and data powered by 5G. These topics will have big impacts on identity as digital identification becomes more frequent and more frictionless. So that's all of the background for Money 2020 Vegas 2019. And now to take a closer look at the financial biometrics market in particular, it's my pleasure to introduce my friend C. Maxine Most, Principal Analyst at Acuity Market Intelligence. With decades of experience in the market, no one knows the digital identity landscape like Acuity. Take it away, Max.
Thanks, Peter. And good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody. I'm just going to talk a little bit today about fintech, financial services, and biometrics relative to what we saw at Money 2020. So that brief overview that Peter gave, I think, is going to be quite useful. And the topic of my conversation is really based on something that David Birch said at Money 2020 when he introduced our panel. If you know who somebody is, payments are easy. And this is not a simple concept because it wasn't too long ago that identity was really not considered a critical component of the payments landscape or the fintech landscape. So that's the context. Just a little bit about my company. If you don't know about Acuity Market Intelligence, we've been around for almost 20 years. We provide intelligence, strategy, and marketing services. We've really delved into the biometrics space and related digital identity technologies over those years and consider ourselves to be really the definitive source for market intelligence on the industry. You can see we've worked with lots of main players, including some of the folks on the panel today. So if you're interested in finding out more about us, please feel free to visit the website later on or reach out to me directly. Okay, and with that, we'll dive into our conversation. So using that context that if you know who somebody is, payments are easy, I just want to talk to you a little bit about my impressions from Money 2020, which was what, 2 weeks ago now? Time seems to be condensed these days. So let's jump into that. Peter, you can go hit the next slide. Okay, so fintech is decidedly mainstream, and that may sound like a trivial statement, but for those of us who've been going to Money 2020 since I first started, I believe in 2012, 2013, I think 2013 was the first year I went. What to me was substantially different is that this notion of integrating technology into financial services is just sort of the starting point for the digital transformation and evolution of these industries. And it's no longer just flirting around the edges. And what I mean by that was it's no longer just about adding an app onto the edge of this, you know, these old traditional financial institutions and sort of trying to make them look pretty. We're now seeing fintech, which is the introduction of obviously technology into financial services, penetrate further into the organization. And so what we're seeing is sort of an enterprise scale ambition, which I think makes a lot of sense given what Peter's notes from the Money 2020 marketing person about scaling up. Because when you talk about scaling up, it's not just about mergers and acquisitions and large organizations, it's about bringing fintech into the enterprise in a meaningful way across the board. And I kind of say this with a little bit of snark: forget innovation, think integration. We're not really totally forgetting innovation, obviously, but integration is a really different kind of problem to solve. And obviously it does involve innovation, but it's no longer sort of random acts of innovation around the edge. It's really thinking of, on an enterprise scale, how does technology, how are these innovative technologies we're seeing really fundamentally changing the way business operates? And biometrics has definitely gone from sort of the lonely bastard cousin to the celebrated love child. And I say that in particular around Money 2020 because in 2012, 2013, nobody really wanted to talk about biometrics. And I give a lot of credit to Peter O'Neill, the founder and president of FindBiometrics, who I'm sure you all know, who really single-handedly, I think, pulled the Money 2020 folks into understanding how critically important biometrics is vis-a-vis identity really becoming the key to the next wave of fintech. And that's where we are today. We really are seeing that opening of this this notion that payments and money are going to become synonymous with identity. So again, if you know who somebody is, then payments are easy. And these four, you can go and hit the next slide, Peter. These four ideas, and I kind of reverse the order here because I think when you think about structurally how you're building technology, this is sort of how they sit. What I saw over and over again at Money 2020 as I walked around, and I do this every year, is I look at the booths, and from just a purely sort of marketing, strategic marketing perspective, see what kind of terminology is being used to talk about the marketplace. And what I saw over and over again, oh, can you go back for a second? Sorry, was these four words: platform, orchestration, identity, and user experience. And I think why this is important, again, is it reflects this notion that what we're talking about now is enterprise scale ambition, where you want to integrate these, integrate the technologies and identity-based processes into the entire infrastructure of the organization. Okay. So orchestration, I heard this over and over and over again, and I think this is really interesting because what we're talking about is really bringing fintech sort of generally or broadly, and identity more specifically, into the enterprise to operate across the silos, to create a truly cross-functional approach to looking at fraud prevention and detection, as well as also providing a improved user experience. And so you're talking about integrating technologies, and Peter mentioned some of these: AI, machine learning, big data as well, to create a 360 view of identity, which then truly enables this idea of combining security and convenience to create a frictionless user experience.
Yeah, if I can jump in right here, Max, I think this is a really key component for our discussion going forward, is the idea of combining security and convenience. For so long, especially near the beginning of the Money 2020 conversation, like 5-6 years ago, like you're saying, it has always been sort of a balancing proposition rather than this combined value proposition. So I think that's an important thing for everybody to keep in mind.
Yeah, and it's not just biometrics obviously enables it, it's this, excuse me, this integration of all these different technologies. So I think that's really critical as well. Okay. So this notion of a single view, I think, is really, really interesting. And for me, when I think about artificial intelligence, machine learning, data mining, all of these other things, I think about those as the connective tissue. And I think about biometric, a secure, reliable, and privacy-based, privacy-enhancing deployment of biometric-based identity as sort of the hard link within this infrastructure. And those things have to operate together. And the more closely they are aligned and integrated, the higher degree of certainty we will have about who is operating within this financial services space. And the notion of a single view of the user is really important, not just because it's highly valuable inside the organization, and not just because it improves the customer experience, but it actually delivers on this promise of technology within financial services, which is to offer the right product to the right customer at the right time. And so what does this mean for all these established financial service players? You know, a lot of people talk about, you know, digital transformation, and then you look at the dynamics, you know, there's one argument to be made that, you know, these big organizations are kind of doomed. They just can't survive this radical transformation, technology-based transformation. And I would say what's really interesting when you start thinking about the full impact of digital transportation is that these organizations today have a ton of data. And I would argue over time, as we move to a biometric-based identification system, that less and less of our sensitive PII will be residing within these organizations. But what they will have is it's just an amazing wealth of data in terms of the products and services that individuals are accessing. And that actually really creates a defensible bulwark for them in terms of creating true customer intimacy, really being able to respond and anticipate to customers. So I think that's the contrast we're going to see, is sort of this agility and flexibility and innovation sort of the upstart fintechs, and sort of some of the sort of institutional understanding of big data and the evolution of big data management within those larger organizations. So what did I learn at Money 2020, 2019, which I think I kind of like saying that, Money 2020, 2019. Fintech is, as I said, decidedly mainstream. This era of dancing around the edges is really coming to an end. We're really starting to see the technology penetrate into the organization. Integration is now sort of the key word as opposed to innovation in terms of the ability to develop and deliver enterprise scale solutions that drive this marriage, if you will, of convenience and security, and that identity and payments are basically on the path to becoming synonymous. And finally, as I mentioned, biometrics are no longer the bastard cousins of fintech. I mean, people are sort of now have fully accepted, if not embraced, that if you want to move forward in this market space, that the human identification is a key component. Yeah, so you can go ahead and click through these, Peter. So basically, you know, what I think is really interesting is the marketplace has caught up with this moniker, Money 2020. When it started, it seemed like it was a long way in the distant future, and now we're there. And I think in some respect, the mission has been accomplished in regards to creating this environment where you're bringing together the innovators and the established organizations to create the next generation of money. I think we've done that. And so now I think we need, you know, as Peter mentioned earlier, we need to figure out how we make all this stuff work together. And so then, of course, you know, is it time to change the name onto something else? And finally, I just wanted to let you guys know, those of you who know about Acuity, is we introduced a new website not too long ago. We have our old biometrics focus. It's still there. We're still, you know, obviously highly involved in the biometrics space, but we're also broadening our services out across the board to really helping innovative tech companies thrive with intelligence services, strategy services, and general marketing services. You can go ahead and click, Peter. So those are the three areas we focus on, and these are the market sectors where we're really where we have expertise, and we've put together a really talented group of people. So please go ahead and go through the next slide. Visit the website, check us out. Feel free to contact me. You can get to the old biometrics content directly, or come through the front door at the new URL. And please follow me on Twitter if you're interested in my ongoing assessments and sometimes snarky remarks about what's going on in the world of digital identity and emerging technology.
Thank you so much for that report, Max. And yeah, and I highly recommend everybody check out the new Acuity website. So that really set everything up for this exciting panel discussion we have planned for you today. Please join me in welcoming today's experts. We have Gary Jones, Vice President, Global Channel and Marketing, Biometric Access and Time Solutions from IDEMIA. We have Courtney Gibson, Chief Technology Officer and CISO of BioConnect, and Laura Coffey, Director of Policy and Strategic Accounts at Onfido. Experts, thank you for joining me today. Max will also be participating in this panel. Let's get started. So we're living essentially in the decade of the data breach, and financial services is not exempt from this. My first question to the panel is, how can biometrics be deployed to protect financial institutions from becoming the next big data breach target? Courtney, can we start with your opinion on this, please?
Sure. Thanks very much, Peter, for having me on today. I think really when financial institutions are looking at data breach, my sense is they're looking at two different vectors. One is a breach of their end users' accounts, and the other is sort of the insider threat risk of their own employee accounts internally. And I think there's a risk on both sides of the transaction equation that biometrics can play a role in, and I think there's a real risk there. I think from the end user perspective, there's still a lot of financial services that are protected with passwords. This is a 58-year-old technology that has been around a long time, and it has just not kept pace with the reality of how financial transactions are taking place online now. My main job is at BioConnect. I wear another hat at the University of Toronto as well, doing research on cybersecurity issues. And I find nearly 250,000 password breaches a week occurring. The rate at which end user credentials are compromised and the rate at which people reuse passwords mean that it's incredibly corrosive to trust. I think there's a lot of breach risk around end users that are relying on passwords for security. Are just finding that's not keeping up, right? My own life, I get chat with my mother. It feels like once a week. I get some concerned query from her about she got some what's ultimately a phishing email coming in saying that her account's been breached, needs to click on something to reset her banking password. So I think there's a real opportunity to move away from secret-based authentication to determining who end users are through trust mechanisms, and I think increasingly biometrics are being used there to give the security that's needed without forcing people to rely on remembering and changing and dealing with passwords, and that's a shift I think for end users. I think the other one is really on the employee side. Any organization, sort of 5 to 10% of employees tend to be caught up in phishing campaigns as they roll out, and there's a real risk that the people who have access to all of the internal data on customers, their own accounts internally may be compromised, and banks have been moving through a variety of technologies, whether it's RSA tokens or other, secrets wrapped up in other forms to protect from insider threats. But there's regulatory need now to know who is accessing and dealing with customer data. There's a real need to protect transactions that are taking place from employees. But I think on both sides of it, one is establishing trust with end users and really knowing who you are conducting a transaction with. And the other one is ensuring that secret-based passwords don't leak out and get used for other purposes. You need to know the person making the internal request is really the authorized person who should be doing that. I think there's two different elements there.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that focusing in on that secret-based authentication aspect is really the core to this conversation. Gary, can I get you to weigh in on this as well, and also with the sort of follow-up question of how difficult is it for financial institutions to deploy biometrics to this end that Courtney has been talking about?
Sure, Peter, thank you. So I think just to add on to what Courtney was saying is that when breaches occur, it's for a few different reasons. The one is obviously to gain access to identity information, which can be easily traded online, for reuse in many different cases or use cases. And the other one is obviously to get access to customers' financial accounts to be able to conduct fraudulent transactions. And sometimes those two, cross over with each other. So I think that one point I would just add or stress is that this is not something you can fix in one place only. For sure, the internal systems of any financial institution, from a single sign-on point of view, need to have biometrics to make sure that access to those internal systems are protected in a multi-factor fashion, biometrics plus something else, typically a PIN or password, etc., or a card. But you also need to make sure that downstream, if in fact some data is hacked or stolen, when it gets to the checkpoint, whether it's an online checkout or a retail store checkout, that there is yet another line of defense to authorize the customer with biometrics as well. Obviously, the one interesting question, which maybe we'll talk about later on, is about the level of effort. At what point do you insist that biometrics is used in any given transaction? Is it a function of the size of the transaction or the frequency, etc., or even in some kind of random pattern? The other just quick point I wanted to add is also that in many countries, it's long been legislated already to do enrollment biometric registration during onboarding when customer accounts are opened. I think this is a practice, obviously, that needs to be looked at much more seriously on a global scale. You have to know your customer, obviously, and knowing that customer also is part of identifying who they genuinely are, as opposed to what name they actually put on the account application, and also to see if that person already exists in some database of known offenders, financial offenders, fraudsters, etc. Because again, depending on which country, access to those types of records and databases do exist, and I think they need to be more aggressively utilized. Just very quickly to then touch on your question about how easily can it be deployed. I think this is, for me, going to be one of the most interesting things to watch over the coming years. It's great to see the level of interest and acceptance now within the financial sector about the need to use and include biometrics in transactions, in enrollments, etc. But I think that I'm hoping that we don't see a lot of, let's say, bad deployments because people are jumping in without considering the practicalities. You have to be sure to include multimodality, for example, to give people the option to use different biometrics. This can be a function of region, cultural, religion, etc. And you have to respect users' rights and give them the choice to use a biometric that's comfortable for them, and then also one that will work in a variety of applications. For example, deploying a biometric that will work in an outdoor store location is very different to what you might do in an indoor store location, just to give a very simple example. But I think, and we'll talk about this a bit later, the good news is that the financial sector is not the first sector to have to deal with these questions or challenges. It's been done in many other sectors for a long time, and also for different use cases aside from payments. So there are some good benchmarks and reference points to look at, which we'll come back to later in the conversation.
Absolutely, thank you, Gary. And Laura, do you have anything to add to this, especially considering your background in policy? Be interested in hearing your thoughts.
Yeah. So yes, I do have a policy background. I also used to work at Lloyds Banking Group, which is one of the biggest UK banks, retail banks. So on the point on how easy is it to deploy biometrics, I think we're seeing a lot of deployment. At Onfido, we work closely with lots of UK fintechs and very much use the facial biometric for the onboarding journey. We think there's a huge amount of potential for the account takeover customer journey as well, to use biometrics to make that better and safer. And back to Courtney's point on password breaches as well, to re-verify your account when you've forgotten the password, which can be a real pain point for customers. And if we start thinking about it from a customer point of view, there is nothing more infuriating than the bank trying to establish you are who you say you are by asking you, for example, to name the last 5 transactions and how much did you spend. And certainly with the advent of contactless payment in the UK, I personally have failed that several times myself, and it is infuriating to, from a customer point of view, to be asked to prove you are who you say you are, and you're like, well, I'm just me. And I think that's where the biometric deployment can actually come in to improve that customer experience considerably.
Absolutely, and that actually runs really well into my next question here, which I'll direct at Max first. It seems that from, at least from a public perception angle, a major roadblock in deploying user-facing biometrics is the rapidly evolving regulatory landscape and the controversy surrounding it. It's about the transactional experience. But biometrics have this operational side of things. So how are biometrics being deployed within financial institutions, and to what benefit?
So what we're really, the focus really has been on the end user experience for account access and payment side, the payment side. And what we're seeing growing out of just sort of the convenience of accessing accounts through mobile phones, growing into a vehicle for fraud detection and prevention. And that to me has really been where the focus, we've seen the focus most recently in financial services, and layering on multi-factor authentication, which includes not just the direct response-based authentication of, okay, you know, I need to stick my face in front of the camera, put my fingerprint on to do a certain thing, but passive authentication used for, as I said, fraud detection and prevention in the background. This has really been a tremendous focus. And sort of the question is, how do you integrate the authentication technology, biometrics, along with device authentication, device fingerprinting, as it's called, using geolocation, using access location and patterns of access, all of these things being sort of integrated into a fraud detection and prevention system, which looks at not just, you know, things like synthetic identities and identity theft, but also bots and sort of all this innovative automated technology that are trying to penetrate accounts. So that's really where we've seen this evolving. And so now, you know, along with you know, this notion of orchestration, we're starting to see this penetrate further and further into within the organization. And as Courtney and Gary sort of alluded to, you know, there's an inside and outside view. It's not just used for customer experiences and customer authentication, but also how do you build that into the infrastructure of the organization and then start using it for physical and logical access control, for audit trails. So there's tremendous opportunity. And so the question is, you know, how do we see that grow inside, sort of from the outside to the inside of the organization, moving from the fringes to the central structure of managing operations within the organization, and how does that kind of spider web grow within each individual organization? And then you're really talking about those notions that I was talking about earlier, which is platform and orchestration and identity. How does that fit into the overall IT infrastructure? And I think there's gonna be some pain trying to get that to work, but I think we're gonna have to start sort of reinventing the way we think about managing IT from the inside out in these organizations.
Absolutely. And, you know, going on that physical and information security touch point and IT infrastructure point that you just brought up, I'd like to know, Courtney, since this is part of BioConnect's specialty, the sort of converged access paradigm, how does that fit into some of the challenges that banks are experiencing when coming to deploying biometrics on the institutional level?
Sure. I think in my mind, I may take a step back and just sort of explain when I think about biometrics. I think there are sort of in a very gross sense, there's three sort of defined use cases that sit under that umbrella of biometrics. I think in terms of mass adoption, you know, as Touch ID came out on phones and people really started to get comfortable in a large scale sense of dealing with biometrics for day-to-day transactions, they started as a way effectively of locking up my device or protecting my information, and there was a real growth in use of biometrics to create padlocks to lock things up and protect my own information, protect other people from getting into my data and my devices. I think as we've evolved into needing to use these for financial transactions, for internal risk mitigation, it's really it's a separate use. It's using biometrics to build trust, you know, between the physical and the digital world, really needing to know who is on the other end of the transaction. And that's different than me creating a padlock around the around my device or around my data. There's an element of enrolling, you know, how are users enrolled? How do I really know the person on the other end of that transaction? And I think you know, I think everybody on the panel has talked about it. This notion of combining other elements of the person sitting on the other end of that keyboard, whether it's knowing physically that they're in a particular place, knowing where they are in that place, knowing whether they're behaving normally. I think bringing in all of these other contextual elements around who the person is and what they're doing And yes, one of the things that certainly we're doing is looking at how do we combine physical transactions with transactions in the physical world within the building that you're occupying or within the the physical space that you're conducting that transaction. How do we bring that into the mixture to really help build that element of trust so that we're building a bridge and not just a padlock? And I think the third leg that biometrics falls into, and I sense we'll get into the regulatory discussion a little later. The third use for biometrics, and the one that there's a lot of legislative attention on, is sort of the creepy end of biometrics, which is sort of passively tracking people and using that information for other purposes. And I think that's a whole other can of worms around biometric use. But I think this transition from just Touch ID sort of padlocks on my phone to really establishing true trust in from the physical into the digital world. There's a lot of work being done there, and that's one of the transformations I think that biometrics is going through as well.
Absolutely, and that fits into a bit of what Gary was saying earlier. Gary, do you have any further comments on the IT infrastructure point of view in terms of this convergence and nuance?
So just one comment regarding maybe a little bit more towards the buy-in or adoption side of things. So, or user acceptance. It's where we've seen the most success in large deployments has certainly been where the opt-in approach has been given, and vendors or institutions have provided their customers the option to use biometrics or not, and then even go further to say, if you want to use biometrics, you have the option to store it on your own, in your own wallet, whether that's a mobile wallet or a physical wallet or a physical card, or if you want that extra layer of convenience, we can store your biometric for you, and you never have to carry anything. So all of those options can be used or mixed depending on the use case. That's just one thing from a take-up point of view, where we've seen systems really be very successful, because people, they can step into it gradually, but again, it does come back to making sure that on the back end they feel the system is trustworthy, using their data. From a deployment point of view, what we've seen is when you look at in the physical world, the financial institutions have been using biometrics for a long time to protect their facilities, whether it's corporate facilities, headquarters, different country, region offices, etc., and even at the branch level, whether it's managing the cash storage areas, even the cash in transit vehicles. Biometrics has long been trusted for those physical security use cases, and more recently, since around 2015 thereabouts, the biometrics industry itself has taken a massive leap forward in what we call frictionless biometrics, which means you can literally be authenticated on the move without even stopping. And in these areas, when you're using the technology for physical access control, if you think about how many times you go in and out of a door in your lifetime in your workplace, over a 20-year period, you can easily exceed, 100,000 transactions. That's how many times you might go in and out of a door. And if every one of those is a biometric transaction, which is the reality in many organizations today, that's far more biometric transactions than you would likely ever conduct with your bank. And the key point there is that from a technology point of view, the biometric industry is at a point where frictionless identification or verification is absolutely possible in a diverse range of environments and with a very high throughput capability. So it's now a matter of fine-tuning the deployment of those technologies, in a retail space and online as well, and making sure that it's accessible by the widest, type of audience.
Absolutely. We're getting a lot of questions in here about the role that payments currently play in the financial biometrics market, and so I'm going to kind of pivot here for the next question. Payments have served as the entry point for the entry point biometric use case, with mobile wallets serving as the main customer authentication point, second to a device unlock, as we've talked a little bit about, as far back as 2014. But how have biometric payments evolved since then, and can they still be considered the front line for mainstream biometric adoption? And Laura, can I get you to start on this one, please?
Sure, yeah, and I wanted to also pick up on the point previously about this idea of frictionless biometrics, which I fully agree with, but I also think we should be mindful that there is a little bit of friendly friction that makes our users feel safe, that makes them feel like there's a little bit of friction around security and privacy. So I don't think that we should lose sight of that in the journey towards mass adoption of biometrics. But on the point on payments specifically, I guess I would say yes, I consider this to continue to be the forefront of it. We've seen initiatives in China already. We've seen Smile and Pay. We've seen the trend that you were talking about, naked payments, at the beginning of this webinar. So yes, the broad picture here is biometrics plays a critical role in enhancing security, and with the frequency of payment transactions, we would see that as a key route for adoption of this kind of technology. But back to my previous point, I think there's from a customer journey experience, a little bit of a friendly friction here before we move to that completely passive biometric stage.
Yeah, and Max, can I get you to jump in on this one too, especially with that near frictionless payment, naked payment thing happening?
Yes, that is friendly friction. I like that, Laura. That is a concept that is near and dear to my heart, because those of you that have heard me talk on this subject will know that I say that the objective is not frictionless. The objective is to create friction that's commensurate with the level of risk and value of the transaction. So, you know, I think that, you know, this talking about, you know, payments and mobile wallets as an entry point, and then, you know, well, it's an entry point to what? And again, I come back to this idea of not only payments being synonymous with identity, but thinking about identity as the foundation of IT infrastructures that allow us to operate, whether that's within the organization internally, or with the interaction with customers. And I think one of the ideas also that it's important to think about, and this relates to this notion of frictionless or friendly friction, and thinking about building out infrastructures and adoption is, you know, we're seeing a lot of deployment of behavioral biometrics, which is sort of happening in the background now. Many organizations, financial institutions and e-commerce companies are using behavioral biometrics. They've integrated it into their customer interaction process. And so there's a continuous authentication that's going on sort of in the background that is managing fraud. And then there's this idea of step-up authentication, which is where, you know, where do we need actual point-in-time authentication? And so I think part of this process, and it goes back to, again, to this other idea of, like, you know, we have the technology, it's working, it's sort of mainstream, how do we get the stuff all to work together? And so I think really there's a need for frameworks that really define, you know, how we use it, where we use it, what's appropriate, you know, what are the standards. And one of the ideas I think that's really, again, near and dear to my heart is, where does this data live and who manages it? And I would argue that to actually solve some of these problems we're talking about, you need really independent biometric authentication. I really believe you need third parties to provide the identification and authentication independent of all of the organizations that want to access it, so that you basically purpose build an IT infrastructure to manage and secure biometric data that's separated from other PII, and that you use that as a means of providing the identification and authentication at any step in the process, whether it's internal or external. And I think how we're going to get from where we are to there is kind of tough, but I think in order to really see sort of this broadly based mainstream use of this technology on a regular basis, we're going to have to do that, and we're going to have to separate it, and we're going to have to build IT that's specifically designed to manage and protect it because of the sensitivity of the data and the concerns. And this goes back to the regulatory issues and privacy and everything else. You can't have 10,000 organizations holding your biometric data sitting in files with the rest of your PII. There's no way to manage that.
Absolutely, and to build on your point there, Max, I think there's a couple of things that come out for me. One is the need for the regulators to come in and build those policy frameworks that keep our customers safe. And secondly, this concept of identity is kind of the foundational layer, I think is exactly bang on. And the interesting trends that we're seeing in the identity space around decentralized identity, around self-sovereign identity, that really put power and control in the user's hands, and have at their heart this idea of decentralization, so no centralized hackable database of biometrics, is absolutely crucial. And certainly at Onfido, we're doing a lot of work on the future of identity, and we have some portable or reusable identity pilots happening today in the FCA, that's the UK regulator, in the FCA sandbox, that I think have a lot of potential in this space. But we would absolutely see, I guess, twin roles: one for the regulators to put those frameworks in place, and secondly, this trend towards customers owning and controlling and permissioning the use of their own data.
And Gary, would you like to jump in on this too, please?
Sure, thanks, Peter. So just one additional point of clarification around, from a pure biometric perspective, the concept of frictionless, can encompass many different levels of security. With technology today, you can have a vast difference in security enforcement with two different systems that can both be classified as frictionless. So, for example, spoof detection is really one of the last lines of defense. If we assume that at some point biometrics could be stolen, then you really do need to have spoof detection built into the system. And again, in the world of frictionless biometrics, you can have some technologies that only have a limited degree of spoof detection because of how they scan or acquire the biometrics, whereas others have very, very robust forms of spoof detection because of the sensor or image technology that's used. And obviously there are different price points for that. But I think the important point is, again, from a pure technology point of view, the good news is that these systems can be tuned according to the requirements and to the levels of security that are needed. And then just one last point is that obviously spoof detection can also take on the form of incorporating behavioral characteristics into the process as well, not just physical in terms of when we measure the actual biometric itself.
Absolutely. And we're just getting a ton of questions in, so thank you everybody in the audience. I do want to move on from this topic. One thing that we're seeing a lot of are people asking about the controversies around current regulations, like the Illinois BIPA, the new California Act, the CCPA, and that kind of fits into GDPR as well. Courtney, I would like to direct this question to you at first. What are the best practices for ensuring compliance with these new regulations, and how can the biometrics and financial industries use these deployments to educate end users about consent and PII, personally identifiable information?
Absolutely. I think whether we're talking GDPR or whether we're talking sort of the emerging US legislation, all of these legislative umbrellas really contemplate three things. One is the user needs to consent to how their biometrics are being used. You can't use them for improper purposes, and you need to secure against loss. And I think there's elements of what the whole panel's talked about, I think, that touch on all three of those. I think for the legitimate purposes that we're talking about here for financial transactions, there is a real need to bind physical users to their digital identities. You need to know who's conducting that transaction. And in terms of sort of education and consent, at the time that you're actually verifying that it's the user coming in is the right time to do the enrollment. And I think people who have done this well from a privacy compliance standpoint are taking the opportunity at the time they present the biometrics out to the users. You need to do a binding step to know that this is, I'm Courtney coming back to claim my identity when I go to do a future transaction. Just being clear about where and how we are going to be using biometrics. It can be done, and it is being done well, I think, at that binding step. But it's we need to be mindful that there's this requires a bit of a shift. I think Max talked about it. Laura talked about it, you know, with the need, you know, this approach for decentralized identity, locking that away somewhere, I think is just a bit of a shift. There's a lot of, and this is not unique to the financial services industry, there's a real tendency to, you know, monetize information about customers, use it for other purposes, really needing to draw a hard line in the sand and lock that information away somewhere where it's only being used for the purpose it's being collected for, is a key part of complying with the legislation and dealing with the third part, which is the risk of loss, right? And I think, you know, we just need to continue to build out systems with this view that biometric information is private information for me, but this attestation in terms of, you know, if I'm banking with a particular bank, you know, their binding to me is public. My biometric information needs to stay separate, and I think it's just there's an educational component, and there's also a shift in just how, as software developers, we're dealing with those data elements.
Mm-hmm. I think that that's all very agreeable. Does anybody else on the panel have anything to add to that? I'd like to get 2 more audience questions before we call it a day here. Okay, so we are getting some other questions here about different sort of matching paradigms. Right now, we have a question on the docket. What technology are you seeing as the enabler to use biometrics for user authentication, and how does the sort of on-device matching paradigm and the on-server centralized paradigm fit into it? Max, I'd like to start with you on this, please.
Great, so this is terrific because I was having trouble unmuting myself. My screen locked up and I wanted to make a quick comment about what we heard before. So basically, this idea of, you know, locking away the identity, I think that's really important. And so when I think about on-device versus centralized, in order to really use biometrics effectively across channels and applications and not be in a position where individual organizations have to store your biometrics, and that you can get beyond on-device authentication, because really when you authenticate yourself to your mobile phone with biometrics, every authentication that's happening beyond that device is actually a device authentication. You're saying your device is saying you are who you say you are, and then the device is telling the world that. So I think you need a combination, and I think that in my vision, what you need is a independent third-party service that is purpose-built only for managing and deploying biometric authentication, but that within that construct, you're actually disaggregating that data. So it's not as if you have one big single database where everything's stored. You have a system of multiple disparate storage locations where individual template data gets, you know, shredded and stored in separate places. So it's a combination of decentralization and centralization. In terms of how it operates to the user, it's centralized, but in terms of the actual background structure, it's not. So that to me is going to be required to do sort of broad-based applications of biometrics where it doesn't matter what device you're on or what channel you're using or, you know, what organization you're operating in. And then there's going to be other cases where you're actually going to do the authentication on the device, but right now there's no provisioning on devices. My device doesn't know whether it's me or my daughter. Both of our fingerprints are enrolled. So I think there's a lot of work that has to get done in terms of regulatory, you know, privacy structures, and also actual IT infrastructure to allow this kind of full-scale use of biometrics across multiple applications to happen.
Absolutely. Does anybody have anything to add to that? I know it's a bit of a loaded question, given the current biometrics landscape.
I think
I'd like to add a quick.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah.
I was just
go ahead.
One follow-on sort of observation to Max's comment there. I think as we move from active to passive biometrics in particular, there's a real risk and a slippery slope around how the data is secured. I think when we've had sort of in the past just you know, discrete active biometrics, I put my fingerprint, you know, finger on a finger scanner, that it's easier to secure, it's easier to educate people as we move towards this passive world where there's a constellation of elements that are coming in. That really implies that a bunch of measurements are being brought together on some remote server. It's harder to describe what's being measured, how it's being combined. It becomes a little more opaque. And I think even looking at just phones as an ecosystem, it's been interesting to watch as we moved from sort of, not to single out Apple here, but just as a particular example, as we moved from Touch ID to Face ID and sort of a passive shift. Touch ID was very locked down. The fingerprint template was inside the secure enclave on the phone. You couldn't get access to it. It was on device only. And as we moved to Face ID, SDKs have opened up. Now applications can get the facial mesh off the scanner. There's a whole characterization of are you smiling or frowning or raising an eyebrow as you're interacting with this scanner that's now available to be exported off the device and taken away for other measurements. And some of those can enhance security and some of them can degrade them. So there's I think Max is bang on there. There's a real risk that we need to balance between getting higher quality passive authentication and being able to manage the risk of where that data is going and what it's being used for.
Absolutely. And Gary, what would you like to say?
Yeah, just a real quick point to add on to that, which is around, when we talk about on-device authentication, whether it's identification or verification, it definitely is. This is one of the interesting challenges that I think that has to be addressed in mass deployment, which is you can't force customers to use a specific brand or model of phone. Different phones, for example, will have different quality of cameras if you're using it for face, or fingerprint sensors if it's for that purpose. And this can sometimes present its own set of challenges in terms of maintaining a consistent level of matching assurance in a diverse range of devices that are out there in the field. So there is the other question about on-device, meaning an actual device that is in the retailer, for example, or in the ATM. We've seen a lot of banks deploy biometrics in their ATMs. Those are more controlled environments where you know what the technology is and you can what the matching thresholds are, what the assurance levels are, etc. So this is just one of those very interesting trade-off questions that I think is going to be a good one to watch as the industry evolves.
Absolutely. And Laura, do you have any final thoughts on this?
Yeah, final thought from a customer point of view, I guess, is this is fabulous dichotomy that we have as customers, which is keep my stuff safe and don't annoy me. And it's balancing those two things, I think, for the future evolution of biometrics. And I absolutely think privacy needs to be front and center. I think it's it's good that the regulators are starting to engage with this, are starting to be very thoughtful about this sort of data. Certainly in the UK, on Fido's contributing as part of the ICO's sandbox around reducing bias in machine learning algorithms and all of these sorts of innovation. But I think coming back to the customer point of view, is just critical in this space. And I would just echo what Max was saying earlier about getting the friction commensurate with the risk.
Absolutely. So thank you, everybody, today. That is all the time we have, but we do have so many really thoughtful questions here that we will find a way to address them with expert input, because I think that there's a lot of ways that this conversation can evolve and move forward, and it's really fantastic. So thank you again to our panelists and guest presenter for your contributions today. Thank you to our Financial Biometrics Month and webinar sponsors. Again, that's Onfido, BioConnect, and IDEMIA. As always, thank you to Acuity Market Intelligence for the research, and again, to our premier financial sector events partner, Money 2020. To learn more about the topics discussed today and to find more about the follow-up content that we will be producing from this, visit FindBiometrics.com and mobileidworld.com. And also be sure to subscribe to the ID Talk podcast on Stitcher or Apple Podcasts. Thank you for joining us today. This concludes the webinar presentation.